So we'll make this a short introduction. My neighbor, Dr. Biren Tandan, who has been practicing here since the 1970s. And we've put together the program here I think you're going to like. And again, there's going to be a lot of familiar names for those who have lived in town a long time. And so without further ado, we'll turn it over to Dr. Tandan.
Good evening. Good evening. Thank you for inviting me to speak to you. I'll do the best I can. So let's get started. The history of doctors in Hammonton stretches over 200 years. As you can see, these slides are self-explanatory, and in the next slide you will see originally there were no resident doctors anywhere in South Jersey because the population of the small hamlets and towns, and if they could be called towns, was very, very small. So they were traveling doctors. They sometimes headquarters in an area, but they traveled to various hamlets and villages to see patients as and when needed. So the area of Hammonton was called, you just saw on the last slide, William Coffin Tract. Next slide, please. Say, Dr. Bowman Hendley is the first doctor who was a real doctor that we can find who serviced South Jersey, including the Hammonton area. And these are the places, as you can see, where he gave his service, and he also saw patients as and when he could get to them. Next slide, please. Now, the most interesting part of this is that there was a Dr. James Still. He was the old black doctor of the Crossroads. He was initially maligned, being a quack, and dismissed. But later, as he practiced, people realized that he really knew his stuff. He was totally self-taught. He used a lot of herbs and the flora and fauna of South Jersey, especially the pine barrens, in his treatment. And there newspaper reports, as well as people thanking him, which were published in local newspapers, as to how he could cure what others could not. Next slide, please. Now, there were two, I won't use the other name, but there were two entrepreneurs in Philadelphia who came down and bought some land in the area where the future Hammonton was supposed to be. They advertised very heavily in New England areas, including Maine, Mass, and Connecticut, for people to come down. They said the climate is salubrious, the lake water is fantastic, and the soil is extremely fertile. Well, it was a slight exaggeration to say the least, but people came down and started settling in around what would be the future town of Hammonton. Slide, please. So the first resident doctor of Hammonton was Dr. Joseph North Sr. He was the first resident physician. The North family arrived from Maine in 1958. He was also a gentleman farmer and a banker, because I do not think anybody in Hammonton or in surrounding areas could make a living without doing something else. So he and his doctor son served the area for decades, as you will see further. So Dr. Edward North was physician surgeon, also politician and banker. He was beloved throughout Hammonton, Folsom, Malacca, Elm, and surrounding communities. He was unfortunately killed after practicing several years while trying to cross an intersection of the train, express train, coming from a house call at 4 o'clock in the morning. And it was February, it's not here, 1899, it was February. So he was on a sleigh. So either he was all bundled up and did not hear the train, or he fell asleep. But it was unfortunate. He was a much beloved doctor in the area at the time.
A question.
Yes, please.
Where's that crossing?
It's Niveson's Crossing. Niveson's Crossing is about a mile north of Hammonton. And there's a side story, I'll digress a little bit. There was a Dr. Niveson, she was a female. She was probably trained at Women's Medical College in Philadelphia, but her life's work was taking care of foundlings. Foundlings were unwanted infants who their mothers abandoned due to social reason or other reasons. And she got them and nurtured them. And apparently one of the places where she had them housed in the nursery or whatever was across the railroad tracks from where she lived, closer, I think, to where Rosedale is now, I would guess.
Francis Street, Dr. Tandan, Francis Street.
Okay, so, thank you. So, this is the story of Dr. Niveson. It gets a little more complicated. The town didn't like her or something else happened, and she was sued and had to pay a lot of money. Considering at the time, the value of money at the time was what, $100 or so, right? Next slide, please. So then we come to Dr. Joseph North of the North family. He was a physician and surgeon. Before coming to Hammonton, he was in the Civil War and enlisted in the 1st New Jersey Cavalry. He practiced here briefly, but then he moved to Pleasantville, where he became the mayor and was on the Pleasantville Schools Board for about 15 years or so. Slide, please. Joseph H. North Sr. made it clear in no uncertain terms, so it's rumored, we don't know for sure, that all of his descendants, which were actually 4 sons, in order to inherit anything from him, had to go in the medical field. So all became doctors. Next slide, please. Early in the 20th century, there were several doctors. Dr. John Key, Dr. Balch, Dr. Whitmore, all practicing from 1870s onward. Dr. James North, another son of old Dr. North, practiced for about 2 years and then became a dentist. He retrained and became a dentist and moved to Atlantic City. Dr. Jacob Boas was a long-time Hammonton dentist. And Dr. William North, the youngest son of the old Dr. North, practiced in the Bass River area close to Hammonton. Slide, please. Dr. John Snowden, Joseph Bittler, T.J. Beeling were practicing in the first decade of the 20th century. Dr. Jesse Rohr, Dr. Michael Vane, Dr. Louis Rohde, uncle of the Dr. Rohde we know, and Dr. Carson Adams. Then you have Dr. Russell Ruba in the 1930s, and Dr. DiGiacomo, who was an optometrist in 1932, and Dr. Anthony Rapisi and Dr. Volpe Sr., who came in the 40s. Now, we come to Dr. Anthony Esposito. This is an interesting story in my opinion. He opened his practice, as you see, in 1920, and opened a small hospital, a 12-bed hospital, and his practice was in Washington Street and 12th in the former Richard Burns mansion. So his hospital had 3 nurses, his wife was the head nurse, and he also ran an ambulance service. He became Atlantic County coroner and participated in many civic groups in town. He was the most respected, generous, and well-liked member of the community. Now, there's an interesting anecdote which follows Dr. Esposito. Dr. Esposito soon became a very popular and busy doctor. He performed many surgeries, including tonsillectomies, which I think was his famous surgery. So urban legend has it that he even performed a tonsillectomy on himself in a mirror in full view of invited public. If anybody has picture of that, please give it to the Historical Society.
Yeah, please bring the picture.
Thank you. Next. So now we come to the mid-20th century. In the 40s and 50s, brought many more new medical practitioners to Hammonton. And among them was Dr. Cutler, Dr. Elliott, Dr. Ruba, Dr. Hill. I'm sure a lot of you recognize those names. Dr. Robert Esposito, son of Anthony, he started an X-ray and a lab at Bellevue Avenue. Dr. Fisher opened a modern X-ray facility on Bellevue Avenue, where I live right now, and he sold it to Dr. George in 1966. We all know Dr. Spinelli and the two Dr. Streitfelds, local optometrists. So we come to more in the middle of this last century, where doctors set up practices, and they were affiliated with the hospital, which we'll talk about a little later. And these were doctors Joseph Esposito, son of Dr. Anthony, Dr. Jeanette Anthony, soon followed by Drs. Chiafalo, Mitrovic, Dr. Scafidi, Dr. Hill, Dr. Mejia, Dr. Alex Rodi, nephew of the old Dr. Louis Rodi, Dr. Guzman, Dr. Fernandez, Dr. Volpe Jr., and Dr. Mattioli. Later, they were joined by Dr. Bruce, who was here briefly, Dr. Crane and Jung, Dr. Chona Miranda, and Dr. Nurkowitz. Slide, please. So the typical practitioner setup used to be that the office was attached to the doctor's residence. This lasted for a long time, till I would say about the 60s, when office space became available. The Mattioli building downtown was one, and the other one was the D'Agostino building, the basement on White Horse Pike. 777 building came much later. There was also a medical society of Hammonton, which worked for a brief time here. Doctors would get together, discuss medical matters, and also how they would cover each other on holidays and weekends. But it didn't last too long. Before the advent of cell phones and even beepers before that, there was a privately owned answering service in Hammonton for off hour and weekends. So this is for you especially who are in medical, the gentleman in there. I'm sorry I forgot your name, he's in medical school. Next slide, please. So now let's talk a little about William B. Kessler Memorial Hospital. The idea for the hospital was conceived by the Rotarians, especially involved in that with Mr. Richard Newman. I had the pleasure of knowing him pretty well. And their intention was very modest, 25-bed facility with an emergency room and an obstetrical unit. The plan was expanded later on. I'll tell you about that. And the goal was to collect $400,000, which was a lot of money at that time. So they could only collect about $100,000 with personal and business support, of which $45,000 came from Mr. William B. Kessler and his business. Soon, and with some luck, a federal grant of $400,000 became available because the federal government saw that there was need for more medical care, especially after the implementation of Medicare and Medicaid. So on the plans went. The doctors involved in the inception of the hospital were Dr. Chiafalo, Mitrovic, Dr. Jeanette, Dr. Mattioli, and Dr. George. So a little about Kessler Hospital. So the ground was broken for Kessler Hospital in the middle of a blizzard on February 23, 1963. And here's a picture of Mrs. Kessler doing the digging, if they could dig at that time. Well, on March 7, 1964, Governor Hughes attended the 85-bed grand opening and the first administrator was Richard Sherman, and the nursing supervisor was Mary Train. Now, since we didn't have that many specialists at the hospital staff, so that attracted specialists in various specialties from Atlantic City, Vineland, and Cherry Hill. the hospital prospered well, and we'll talk about it. Slide, please. So as you can see, the picture of the hospital when the first asthma part, when it was only 1 story, and the emergency room was at the corner of Central and White Horse Pike. And in 1987, the hospital expanded to become a 125-bed hospital from 85 beds, with a new intensive care, large pediatric ward, and a new ward on the 2nd story. Here you can see the 2nd story of the building now, as opposed to that. The entrance was also changed. The emergency room was moved from an old location towards the lake, and there was a helipad added for helicopters to land, because there were a lot of accidents. We have 3 major highways going through Hammonton: Atlantic City Express, White Horse Pike, Black Horse Pike, and it was a time when you could drive 75 miles an hour, and people did. So the hospital needed an ambulance service, so we had a volunteer rescue squad. It formally started with interesting history in 1940 by Dr. Elliott and Mr. Lee Littlefield, its first captain until his death in 1962. And the sponsor of the rescue squad apparently was Hammonton Fire Company No. 1. Now, another interesting part is they didn't have an ambulance, so they jury-rigged a hearse from Brash Funeral Home and converted it into an ambulance. Another interesting factor is the siren apparently of that ambulance was so distinctive that when the ambulance took patients to Philadelphia Hospital, the toll takers at the bridge knew which ambulance was coming. That's the ambulance. So that thrived till the 21st century, and due to various reasons, most important being a stringent mandated standards of like continuous training and all that, which volunteers could not keep up. So unfortunately, the volunteer rescue squad closed. We'll show you a few pictures. This rescue squad building, and you'll see about 4 or 5 ambulances. It was a pretty big rescue squad. It covers, I would say, from Elwood, Elm, Folsom, and all other small neighboring towns who couldn't afford to have an ambulance. Now we come to the unfortunate closing of Kessler Hospital. So there were many, many reasons why Kessler Hospital closed. One of the reasons was decline of local industry. Practically all the local garment industry closed. So did Whitehall, and that affected the hospital a lot. Then what happened was the consolidation in the medical field. It was very, very difficult for small hospitals to survive. They could not bear the expense of changing technology was one of the main reasons. The other reason was that the way to survive was to merge with a larger entity. And Kessler tried. They had talks with Atlantic City Hospital, Bristol Hospital, Lady of Lourdes Hospital, and they all failed. So that was the end of Kessler Hospital. Now, new generation of healthcare was lucky that Atlantic City, or Atlantic Care that it's called right now, seamlessly took over the emergency room, Kessler Hospital. So the emergency services continued. People did not have to go out of town for emergency services. And after a few years, they opened their own emergency room and doctor's offices in White Horse Pike, which is currently there. The other major regional healthcare organizations also opened in White Horse Pike, like from Virtua and other places. And this is going on everywhere. I saw Atlantic Care open a place right across from the Shore Memorial Hospital. And we also have one right across from Cape May Courthouse. So this is part of the competitions going on among hospitals right now. Next slide, please. So I have fond memories of my practice in Hammonton. I have fond memories of colleagues, and I'm gonna touch on a few of them. So, no,
No,
you
I-
can
I-
go back. That's
I-
okay. So here's a picture of some of the physicians I work with. On the left is Dr. Miranda, and next to him is Dr. Robleski. You might be familiar with these two. And the foreground is Dr. Kalani, and after that it's me, and then there's Dr. Obeso. He was an emergency room physician, I would say in the 70s. The second picture is Dr. Muchlessy, who was the local hospital pathologist. Then it's me, and then there's Dr. Prasad with glasses on, and then there's Dr. Kalani.
Speaking of glasses, I couldn't cover up all of these glasses.
No, that was just soda in them.
Oh.
So, Dr. Russell Ruba comes to mind. Dr. Russell Ruba his office was on Horton Street, and he, at the beginning, he was also the sanitary and the health doctor for the town of Hammonton. The town of Hammonton also had a venereal disease clinic, because test for syphilis was mandated before anybody could be married at one time. So people have to have a test for syphilis and present it at the time of their wedding or like getting the license to make sure. But he was in charge of that aspect of it. But the most endearing part of my remembrance of it is he became a patient of mine when he was in his 80s. So one time when he came in, I overheard a conversation between him and my secretary. So my secretary would offer him a date and a time, and he would say, I can't come, I have office hours that day. And I was a little amused because he was in his 80s and I was not. So I could not imagine that somebody would be practicing in his 80s till I reached that age. So next is Dr. Scafidi. Dr. Scafidi was always nattily dressed. He always wore a bow tie, and very efficient, and a very popular doctor. He practiced on South Egg Harbor Road, and you could tell he was having office hours because cars will be parked all along South Egg Harbor Road. He resigned from the hospital on a perceived slight. When I resigned from the hospital, I remember Dr. Scafidi that you should stick to your principles. I'm not going to go in any details about his resignation or mine, but I remember Dr. Scafidi at that time. Dr. Robbins was a very interesting person. He was an orthopedic physician who came from Burlington, drove in a snazzy sports car. But the more interesting part was he was missing a hand. He had a prosthesis with a lot of rubber bands attached because I assisted him several times. He was an excellent orthopedic surgeon. So I thought I'd mention him. Then Dr. Mitrovic, fondly known as Mitch to everybody. I don't know how many people remember him, but he was from Yugoslavia. And he trained in New York and then briefly at Ancora Psychiatric Hospital, and he opened his practice along with Dr. Chiafalo in Hammonton. Mitch, in my opinion, did not care much about time. I tell you why. Because oftentimes his office will run past midnight because he loved to talk to patients. It's not like now your 15 minutes is over and that's it. And I can vouch for that because when I started practice at about 2 o'clock in the morning, the telephone rang. It was Mitch at the other end. He said, Biren, I want to refer a patient to you. I want to talk to you about this patient. Of course, I was starting. He was slightly older than me, so I couldn't say anything. But I thought it was very, very interesting. Next, we talk about Dr. Joseph Esposito. He was quiet, one of the most gentlemanly person I have met. I'd give you an instance why, and he was very compassionate. He really liked his patients. When he went to the hospital and he found out, for any reason at all, that one of his patients was admitted to the hospital, he would go visit that patient and ask about his welfare. Now, even at that time, there was a height of compassion. I've seen very few doctors with that amount of compassion. Then we come to Dr. Chiafalo. Nino, as he was known as fondly, he was from Italy, and he loved to repair radios. He also loved airplanes, and he became the commanding officer of the 177th Fighter Interceptor Group, National Guard in Pomona. And he roped me into the National Guard. So because of him, I joined the National Guard, and in the Air National Guard, rather. Dr. Kalani was a much beloved and popular general surgeon. He was from Iran. We soon became very close friends. That's his picture there on the extreme right at the bottom. And we became very close friends and neighbors. Dr. Paul Miranda, whose picture you see on the top picture on the left, was the busiest internist in town. At any given time, he had the most patients in the hospital. Then Dr. Pellegrino was also a well-liked general surgeon. He lived in Berlin, but his office was in Hammonton. He played the piano. He loved to play the piano. And I was surprised when at a hospital party, I saw him take over the piano and started playing all kinds of things on it. Dr. Hong, we all know him. He was from Korea. He was a general practitioner and a general surgeon, and he took over Dr. Jeanette's practice. Prior to that, he was a trained and fully trained anesthesiologist. Dr. Rodi, Alex Rodi, was the nephew of Dr. Louis Rodi. He was a general practitioner, very busy, well-liked. Dr. Miali was from Italy. He was an old-fashioned pediatrician. For a brief time, he had an associate, Dr. Gujarati, for about 3 or 4 years. Dr. Prasad was the most well-liked pediatrician in Hammonton so far as I know. He moved his office in the 70s from Vineland and practiced in the 777 building. He retired. I think he sold his practice to a Dr. Saya, who's practicing now. Dr. Zweibel was also an emergency room physician. He was extremely well-liked, both by the staff, the patients, the ambulance squad, and I never heard anybody say anything negative about Dr. Zweibel. Okay, slide please. Now, I'll take up your time, tell you a little about myself, how I ended up in Hammonton. So, I was looking for it. I arrived here, I'll omit a lot of things, but all I can tell you, in 1972, I was looking for a job, and I didn't have a license. I was a doctor, and you could not practice independently unless you had a license, but you could work for a hospital. Strange. You were still treating patients when that was the law. So they put up a phony internship in Kessler Hospital and other hospitals, so we took care of the patients in the emergency room. So while I worked there, I got lucky. The rules changed, and so all the problems I had with getting a visa or immigration status or the license eased up. I took my licensing examination and passed. Let me tell you, if you don't know a little about all this, is I was already a trained genitourinary surgeon while I was working as an intern at Kessler Hospital. But I couldn't practice because I didn't have the license. To get a license, equivalent to this, suppose you have your PhD in literature and you want to be a professor. They'll tell you, you have to take your high school examination again before we let you become a professor. It's that that's the similar deal, I can tell you. So once you pass the license, all that internship is gone, you're a trained genital urinary surgeon, you can practice. So those are the vagaries of licensing. Also in New Jersey was that you had to be a citizen to practice. The only two places which didn't have this requirement were North Dakota and Washington, DC. So it was all lucky on my part that I could go through all that. So now comes a little bit of an interesting part. It was the end of my work at Kessler Hospital, and I was contemplating what to do. So one day, I was sitting at a table pensively at the hospital cafeteria, lost in my thoughts, when Mr. Richard Newman, who was president of the board of directors of the hospital, ambled by and he pulled up a chair and sat down. So he said, after the pleasantries, he said, I know your term is ending in here, what do you intend to do? I said, I don't know, but I have offers from North Dakota, and one offer from West Virginia. So he says, why not Hammonton? Everybody seems to like you. Let me tell you, flattery is a very stealthy weapon. I fell for it. So I came home and I told my wife what happened. She wasn't thrilled about going to North Dakota or West Virginia. So here we were, husband, wife, one son, no money, rent to pay, car installment to pay, and wanting to open a practice in town. So what do? You have to have an office, right? So looking around for office, no opening in the Mattioli building. Went to see Mr. DiAugustino. He said, well, I have a doctor practicing here who's a cardiologist. You can talk to him. I have no other office. So I talked to him. He said, I work in the daytime. So I said, well, I'll work at night. So I opened my office with a practice Tuesday and Thursday nights and Saturday morning. My staff was my wife and a plastic bag in which we carried some papers and a pen. So this is for your benefit because you're in medical school. That's how in olden days practice started. No computers, no nurse practitioners, no nurses, no gadgets.
What year was this?
This was in 1973.
Wow.
Yeah. To top it off, the malpractice insurance for urology at that time was $1,200, an immense amount for me. That was our entire year's savings. And to tell you another sob story, 6 months later, the company went bankrupt. Well, anyhow, so that was the reason I came here. The other reason is, when I first came to this town, I immediately fell in love with this town. I'm not telling you because you're Hammontonians, because I'm Hammontonian too now. It's that it had everything a small town should have. At least in my, when I drove down Central Avenue, I loved the old houses. There was even a mansion on the lake, I can't remember the name of it. And there was another, I'm sorry? Okay. Well, and there was a huge wall, and I asked Nino Chiafalo one time, what was the wall all about? A friend of his lived there, and I don't remember the name, and he apparently had
That was Mr. Colasurda,
Louis Colasurda. He had like a 5-hole golf course there or something like that. Well, and there used to be a guard there. So I was fascinated. There was a gate with a guard there. Then coming back to the town, it had practically everything you need in a small town. My favorite was the 5 and dime. favorite place to go.
Yes.
3 shoe stores. And clothing store, men's and women's clothing stores. 2 or 3 jewelry store, 2 or 3 hardware stores, and rice hardware store. And if you look at that time from where Bellevue Avenue is down towards White Horse Pike, there were tall trees on both sides with a beautiful canopy. It gave such a great impression to me. I just loved it. So we've lived here now for over half a century, my wife and I, and we have no regrets. Now, before I close, I don't think we have any more slides. Yes, we do?
No, it's the
Yeah.
envelope.
So I'll be remiss if I did not thank Mr. and Mrs. White, who are instrumental for this presentation, including the technology. So I'm deeply grateful to them. And I am just a mere vehicle in this presentation. The presentation is entirely theirs.
Can I say something?
I got him to text.
Finally. No, wait, I'm sorry, I'm not done yet. The doors are locked and there's 1 more hour. No, and I also have to thank my friend Dave Murphy, because without his encouragement, suggestions, and other things, and a little bit of ribbing, this talk would not have been possible. So I appreciate that. And last but not the least, I have to thank my wife, Ursula, for sparing the time and putting up with me, which she's done for close to 60 years now. And so thank you very much. I'll be happy to answer any questions you people have.
That was great.
I just have a comment about the Kessler. So my wife's obstetrician was Dr. Kent.
Yes.
And our daughter was born in 1972, and I was the first male that was permitted to attend the miracle of the birth.
Yes.
That's cool.
1972.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. When I was training, my older son was born in Akron, Ohio, where I was a urology resident there. And it was not fashionable for the husbands to be present at the time of birth. It was very, very seldom. It was discouraged. So in 1972, it's not surprising that you weren't there. Now they practically do the delivery themselves.
Do you want to do the school through the doctors?
Yeah, and I will, yeah, I'm sorry. I'll answer.
Here's the question I have.
Sure,
You talked about some of your colleagues
yes.
and how they like to drive sports cars or play the piano.
Only one.
But I'd like to know what your little secret like that is. What is your passion for? Is it sports cars,
Now,
boats?
then, if you want to stay here for another hour, no,
You can pick
none of that. Well, I'll make it brief, if you don't mind. Yeah. I never wanted to be a doctor. I'm a doctor against my wishes. Now, did I want to be a
Who told
urologist?
you you couldn't inherit anything?
I'm sorry. No,
You
it
didn't
had
have a
nothing
father
to
to
do
tell-
with inheritance. I didn't know what I wanted to do after I became a doctor. That's why I came to the States to train. I didn't like any other medical thing except surgery. So I wanted to go into general surgery first when I came. I came to Misericordia Hospital in the Bronx in 1963 to start my training as an intern. I had already trained in India a little bit before I came in here. So anyhow, it's very, very kind of accidental actually that I went into urology. I was assisting a general surgeon one time. He said, "What are you gonna do?" I said, "Well, I don't know." because I had no ambition or no plans. He said, when you go back to India, there are gonna be a lot of general surgeons, why don't you become a urologist? I said, okay. Now, this is, I'm not making this up, this is true.
Just like that.
You can ask my wife. So, why did you come to Hammonton? You just saw, just accident,
Drove
no
down
planning or
Bellevue
anything.
Avenue.
I could have been in North Dakota. Yes, sir.
Biren, you must tell them the name of your memoir,
Yeah, well,
which is wonderful, a wonderful book.
well, anyhow, which one are we talking about?
The Unwilling Doctor or something?
Okay, so, what I'm telling you, I wrote a book about my days in medical school. I did everything possible to flunk out of medical school. I'm not making this up, I'm just telling you the truth. So I wrote a book about it, The Reluctant Doctor. Unfortunately, it was self-published in India, so it's not available in here. I had a copy, so I gave it to Dave. So that is my story. No fast cars or anything. The only thing of value I have is my wife. Any other questions?
Wonderful.
Yeah, there, everybody, we probably ran out, but, Dr. Tandan wanted to kind of pay tribute to the doctors at Kessler, and that's what we put together on that
So
separate.
you have a list of the doctors who were on the staff at Kessler.
And, you know, there's like 4 of these, but a lot of these names probably look familiar to you. The different disciplines here, some of the names obviously were mentioned earlier too. There he is right there. There's a urologic surgeons there. And he took some heat this morning because he didn't put nurses on.
I said,
Remember the nurses.
so it's nothing, my life has been ruled by nurses. My wife was a nurse too, so anyhow, I don't want to take too much of your time, but that's the story. When I came out of medical school, I don't know how I passed, but I did. The nurses had to teach me how to do the practical part of it. So I was already, all the time, even including Kessler, indebted to nurses. I've always had excellent relationship with nurses. Yeah. Yes, sir.
I think I need to speak for the nurses then.
Yeah, sure.
I'm Kathy Ashton.
Sure.
I was Kathy Romeo for much of my career. And I worked with Dr. Tandan at Kessler. And he was one of the kindest, most patient doctors. There were several that we would call shaking, worried about how we were gonna get yelled at. Never, Dr. Tandan. And if we had a problem or a question or an issue, we could ask him, just like we would ask each other. He was and is one of the most kind, generous, professional, gentlemanly people that I know.
Absolutely.
Well, thank you so much. But I asked her to say that before.
I am not a plant. That was-
You can have a cookie though.
Any other questions?
Not a question, but
Yeah,
I'll make one comment for nurses. My mom was a registered nurse.
Sure.
As you know, nurses have a way of doing things. To this day, every time I make a bed with hospital corners.
Great.
It will never change.
I still don't know how to do that.
Very
Yeah.
good.
But it's been a pleasure being in town. I'm not saying it just because you guys are Hammontonians. I still have my license. I still am a consultant in Ancora, I do the clinic. I do a couple of other charity clinics, and I do something on the computer, barely because I'm totally computer illiterate, answering questions people ask from all over the world in my specialty. Yeah. So,
And you learned how to text.
just this morning. No, I'm a Luddite. I don't believe in high technology. I'm sorry. There's nothing like a human touch,
You're
like
right.
so-called older ways.
You're right.
It's, because you can criticize me for saying this, but I've seen it in restaurants and I laugh.
Yeah.
Husband and wife are sitting and,
They don't even talk,
so
they
they
don't
just
talk.
texting and talking.
Awful.
That's not my concept of technology. So I was telling Mr. White this morning when he visited me that my cell phone sits in that corner near the charger. Sometimes I don't even hear that. Sometimes I don't even go there. So I still have my landline.
Greg, do you put these presentations up on the website? It's still-
This will go up on the
Good,
website.
good.
So you've been a kind audience. I appreciate that. Thank you very much.
Thank you.